turn that on. So the first set of dialogues, you could tell they're interesting because the discussion usually is a real back and forth with everybody being interesting, not just Socrates. But then the middle period, we end up with Socrates doing all the work, and everybody else is basically just saying, wow, Socrates, what a great idea, Socrates. I really like that, Socrates. It's boring, right? And the interesting thing, of course, though, is that Socrates is describing a full-fledged philosophy, which we call idealism, and we're convinced that that's actually Plato's thinking and not Socrates. So the middle period we think of as Plato using this voice, Socrates, as his way of trying to explain his philosophy. Then we get into the third period, and the third period seems to be, my favorite explanation is that he's now had Aristotle as his student for about 20 years, and Aristotle disagrees with a lot of Plato's philosophy. And so you end up with questions that Plato can't answer, and that's reflected in the dialogue. So they're more interesting again than the middle period, and they go back to not being able to solve the questions that are asked. So the Apology is always by everyone considered to be one of the early dialogues, and perhaps the reason for that is because Xenophanes has a similar dialogue that's also called an apology, and they're both descriptions of the trial of Socrates. So they seem pretty close, so it's double coverage, basically, on that. And Plato was actually at the trial, as far as we know, because he's mentioned in the trial. Right? Xenophanes would have written it later with background material. He probably wasn't actually there, so who knows how that works. Another interesting thing is Apollo, everyone knows, is a god. And he's a god of quite a few things, the god of reason, for one thing. So when Apollo is invoked, in a sense, what's the reason for something, right? So we even say that, we use that as a word. We give apologies when something happened that we're sorry about or whatever. I'm sorry I was late or whatever, right? What's the reason I was late because? Ran over about 1,000 screws, whatever. Sorry, I hope none of you had that wonderful experience yesterday. But I guess you read, what do they call it, the screwpocalypse or the screwmageddon? So that's, what do you think? Is the contractor that dropped the screws going to fess up and take the blame?
Probably doesn't even know he did it.
Probably not. So, the Apology. And in the Apology itself, Socrates explains why he's blaming Apollo for it, right? What do you think? You see how that works? Anybody read it yet? Yes? Yes? A couple folks? It's kind of famous. Everybody should read the Apology. And there's lots of interesting questions. Should Socrates have been found guilty? Because they find him guilty. And what was he guilty of? Right? He's guilty of not being pious, not believing in the gods, and so on. Right? But basically in the story, he explains that his friend Chaerephon, which means he's heard the message, basically. Phon is sound, and Chaira, I think, he's picked up the message. He's the friend that goes up to the temple of Delphi, which is still there, by the way. And you can go if you're a tourist, or you could go if you have an Oculus Rift. You don't have to actually So the temple is still there. Big tourist area, lots of buses, lots of people all there, etc. High up in the mountains. And the temple sits over a cleft in the ground where volcanic fumes come up. The Greeks thought of it as the belly button of the world. They thought the world started there, just kind of grew from there. And the tradition was that the priestesses would sit on a tripod over the vent where the fumes are coming up. And of course this would asphyxiate them, right? Because you can't breathe these fumes without losing your senses, basically. So they would take turns, of course. And people would line up and pay the priests to come up and ask the oracle a question. And Chaerephon's question was, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the priestess goes, no. Which, of course, is very confusing. But Chaerephon goes back to Socrates and says, the voice of the god says that you're the wisest. And basically Socrates thinks that's ridiculous because he knows he's not very wise. And so he decides what he's going to do is find somebody who's wiser, and then he can come back to the god and say, you said I was the wisest, but I found Joe Snuffy, who's way wiser than me, so, or whatever. I don't know what he was going to say. Because, of course, the problem is he never found someone who's clearly wiser. He found lots of, he went to the artists, he went to the poets, he went to the teachers, the sophists, and asked, and the famous ones. And this, of course, turns out to be the dialogues. So if we look at the dialogues, what we see are people gathering around, having dinner in a symposium, right? They call it a symposium. One of the books is even called a symposium. But they sit around, they have dinner, and then they drink wine, and they very clearly get drunk, by the way. You could tell by the way the dialogue sort of deteriorates sometimes, right? And they ask one another questions. So what's the nature of the questions? And why is he in trouble for not being pious, right? So let's talk about a couple of things that seems to be going on. One of them is that Greek culture is undergoing a radical change. So this book, The Muse Learns to Write, Reflections on Orality and Literacy from Antiquity to the Present, is a book by Eric Havelock. I don't know if you know John Havelock here in town. He's I guess he was the state attorney general in the Egan administration. Anybody here from, none of you have been here since the Egan administration, I can tell. But John's father, Eric, was a professor at Toronto and then at Harvard. But what he argues, by the way, not everybody agrees with him. This is a fight, right? But what he argues is that up until the point of Plato, the Greek writing has been primarily the Iliad and the Odyssey and other poems of that sort. Herodotus, things of that sort, right? So you've got poems. And Plato doesn't like poetry. It's really interesting. He's teaching the muse, who's poetry, to write prose. So the dialogues are in prose, not in poetry, right? But the culture is still dominantly poetic, So young men primarily learn poems. And the poems are where they learn their values, their understanding of the gods, and things of that sort. So if you're familiar with the Iliad, for example, the Iliad is primarily about a man named Achilles, or Achilles, right? A means not, and Cles means honor. So this